In 9 days, I would sign the papers, take $310,000, and never set foot on my mother's farm again. That was the plan, until a man I had never met called to say the barn door was padlocked, and only my mother had ever known where she kept the key. The coffee maker in my apartment made a sound my mother's old percolator never made. A thin, apologetic hiss instead of that low, rolling gurgle that used to fill her kitchen every morning at 6:15. I noticed the difference every single day, and every single day I told myself it didn't matter, because I hadn't lived under that roof in 14 years. My mother, Dorothy Sutton, had died 11 weeks earlier, quietly in the same farmhouse bedroom where I was born, and I had not been there. I was 2 states away on a work call about a client's tax filings when my cousin phoned to tell me she'd been found by the mail carrier. I have replayed that morning more times than I can count, and I still don't know if being there would have changed anything. I only know I wasn't. Dorothy had spent 31 years running the farm alone after my father left when I was 6, growing peaches and apples on 60 acres in Gilmer County, Georgia, selling them at a roadside stand she built herself out of scrap lumber. She never remarried. She never, as far as I knew, wanted to. She wrote to me every few weeks, letters I answered maybe 1 time in 4, and called on Sundays, calls I sometimes let go to voicemail because I was tired, or busy, or simply out of things to say to a woman whose whole world I had left behind. I told myself distance was just geography. It wasn't. It was a choice I kept making year after year, and she kept forgiving me for it without ever once saying so out loud. There was a second habit of hers I only recognized as significant after she was gone. Every night before bed, my mother wiped down the kitchen counters with a damp cloth in the same 3 strokes, left to right, even when the counters were already clean. A small ritual of order she performed for herself more than for the kitchen. I used to tease her about it as a teenager, telling her the counters weren't going anywhere. She would just smile and keep wiping 3 strokes every night for reasons she never explained and I never asked about closely enough to understand. The one object I could not bring myself to throw away, box up, or sell with the rest of the estate was a green enamel apple-picking basket that hung by the back door for as long as I could remember. My mother used the same basket every harvest for over 2 decades, the handle worn pale where her hand had gripped it 10,000 times. When the estate lawyer asked what I wanted shipped to me before the closing, I said, almost without thinking, the basket by the back door. Everything else, the tractor, the tools, the furniture, 60 acres of orchard, I was ready to let go of for a number on a page. Just not that basket. I told myself I was being efficient. My mother had left behind $11,000 in unpaid property taxes going back 3 years, plus a farm equipment loan with a remaining balance of $36,000 for a total of $47,000 in debts attached to a piece of land I had no plans to farm, live on, or visit more than twice a year out of guilt. A regional buyer, a company called Blue Ridge Land Partners, had offered $310,000 for the full 60 acres, contingent on closing within 21 days of my mother's death being formally recorded. 12 of those days were already gone. I had told myself, and the lawyer, and my husband, that selling quickly was the responsible thing to do. Grief, I had decided, was a private matter I would deal with later on my own schedule after the paperwork was finished. My husband, Tom, had been supportive of the sale from the beginning, mostly because he had watched me disappear into stress every time the subject of the farm came up over the previous 3 months. He wasn't wrong to want it resolved. We had our own mortgage, our own bills, and a marriage that had absorbed more than its share of tension since my mother's death. Most of it unspoken, all of it circling the same unspoken question of how much of myself I owed to a place I had spent 14 years trying to leave behind for good. When the offer from Blue Ridge Land Partners came in, Tom was the one who said, gently but firmly, that clearing $47,000 in debt and walking away with a clean $263,000 in profit sounded like exactly the kind of decision my mother, practical as she'd always seemed to me, would have made herself. I believed him. I believed it right up until the moment Mr. Feeney's name showed up on my phone, a Georgia area code I didn't recognize, on a Tuesday evening while I was standing in my own kitchen, in my own city, wiping down a counter that didn't need wiping in 3 strokes, left to right, without noticing I was doing it until the phone rang. That was the plan until Mr. Aldous Feeney called. Mr. Feeney had never met my mother in person, he explained, but he had corresponded with her for the better part of 2 years about a matter he described only as a personal project of hers, kept in the barn. When I asked what kind of project, he said he wasn't authorized to say more. Only that my mother had asked him in a letter dated 14 months before her death to make sure her daughter saw what was in the barn before any sale of the property went through. He said the barn's east door had been padlocked since the week before she died, and that the only key he knew of was, in his words, somewhere she trusted. I almost hung up on him. I had a closing in 9 days, and a stranger telling me my dead mother had left something in a locked barn that a lawyer I'd never heard of considered his business to protect. But something in the way he said, somewhere she trusted, made me think of the basket sitting in my hallway, still unopened, still carrying the faint smell of hay and dust from the farm. I told him I would call him back. I did not call him back. Instead, I booked a flight to Georgia for the following morning, telling my husband only that I needed to see the place one more time before it stopped being ours. The drive from the Atlanta airport to the farm took just under 2 hours, most of it on a 2-lane road that climbed steadily into the foothills, past orchards heavy with late-season apples that weren't mine to pick anymore. Technically, though no one had told the trees that. I hadn't driven that road in 3 years, since my last visit, and I was startled by how much of it I still knew by feel. The exact curve where the farm came into view, the mailbox leaning at the same crooked angle it always had, the gravel driveway that needed regrading in 2019 and still hadn't gotten it. The farmhouse looked smaller than I remembered, the way childhood places always do, its white paint gone gray at the corners, one shutter hanging by a single hinge. I let myself in with the spare key under the 3rd porch step, a hiding spot so obvious it had never once been a secret between us. Inside, the house smelled like my mother. a mixture of dried lavender, machine oil, and the particular mustiness of old wood that had absorbed 40 years of summer heat. Nothing had been touched since the estate cleaners came through 6 weeks earlier to clear out perishables and obvious clutter. Her reading glasses were still on the kitchen table, folded neatly beside a stack of unopened mail. I stood there for a long moment before I made myself walk toward the barn. Before I got as far as the back door, my phone rang again. It was my cousin Denise, who lived 40 minutes away and had, by her own admission, always assumed the farm would eventually be sold rather than kept in the family. Denise had heard through my mother's old neighbor that I'd flown down unexpectedly, and she wanted to know if something was wrong with the sale. When I told her about the padlocked barn and Mr. Feeney's call, she went quiet for a moment, then told me, not unkindly, that she hoped I wasn't about to let sentiment cost me $260,000 over what was probably just some of Aunt Dorothy's old junk. She reminded me that the extension window was short, that Blue Ridge Land Partners had other properties on their list if I stalled too long, and that grief had a way of making people romanticize things that weren't actually worth saving. I told her I just needed to look. She said she understood, in the tone of someone who clearly didn't, and reminded me to call her the moment I had an answer, since 2 other cousins had already started asking what their share of the estate might eventually look like. I stood there a moment longer after hanging up, feeling the particular loneliness of being the only person who seemed to think a locked barn deserved 5 uninterrupted minutes before anyone started talking about shares. The farmhouse was quiet in a way my mother's letters had never quite managed to describe. A quiet made heavier by how ordinary everything looked, as though she might still walk in from the orchard at any moment. Boots dusty, basket in hand, asking why I hadn't called ahead. But what she hadn't told anyone, not Denise, not the estate lawyer, not even, it seemed, Mr. Feeney in full, was waiting 80 yards behind that farmhouse, behind a door no ordinary key could open. The barn sat about 80 yards behind the house, a squat red structure built by my grandfather in 1958, used for decades to store equipment, feed, and, in my childhood, an old rope swing my mother had hung from the center beam. The east door was exactly as Mr. Feeney described, padlocked, the lock itself old and slightly rusted, clearly not something purchased recently. I tried the spare key from the porch. It didn't fit. I tried 3 others from a hook in the kitchen labeled in my mother's handwriting, just in case. None of them worked either. It was only when I sat down on the back porch steps, frustrated and cold, turning the apple basket over in my hands out of habit, that I felt something shift inside the woven bottom. I pried back a loose strip of wicker my mother had clearly re-glued herself at some point, and found, tucked into a small fabric pouch, a single brass key, old and cool to the touch, with a faded paper tag that read only, "For C, when you're ready. My name is Claire." My mother had hidden a key to her own barn inside the one object she knew I would never be able to throw away. And she had done it based on the tag's condition, at least a year before she died. My hands were shaking when I finally got the padlock open. I told myself it was the cold. It wasn't only the cold. What I found inside that barn would not fit into any of the categories I had built my adult life around. Assets, liabilities, closing costs, square footage. It would take me the better part of a week to understand what my mother had actually been trying to tell me. And by the time I understood it fully, I would no longer recognize the daughter who had booked that flight 9 days before a closing. She had been so certain, so very certain. She was ready to sign. The barn's interior was darker than I expected, lit only by thin slats of afternoon light coming through gaps in the siding. The old tractor was still there, along with crates of tools and a rope swing, faded and frayed, hanging from the center beam exactly where it had been since I was a child. But along the back wall, where I remembered stacks of empty apple crates, someone had built a row of simple wooden shelves, clearly added within the last several years, and every shelf was lined with canvases. There were 41 paintings in total, I would later count. Most were landscapes of the farm itself. The orchard at different times of year, the farmhouse at dawn, a single tree heavy with blossoms, rendered in careful, deliberate brushstrokes that bore no resemblance to the woman I thought I knew, a woman who spoke almost exclusively in practical terms about weather, yields, and unpaid invoices. Tucked among the canvases were 6 spiral-bound notebooks, their covers softened with handling, each one dated in her handwriting on the spine. The earliest notebook began in 1994, the year I turned 3. In it, in ink that had faded to a pale blue-gray, my mother had written about wanting someday to convert the barn into a small painting studio and gallery, a place where she could sell her work alongside the produce, and maybe, she wrote, teach a weekend class or 2 for anyone in the county who wanted to learn. She had sketched floor plans in the margins, where a viewing wall might go, where she'd put a long table for supplies, how she'd keep the center beam and the old rope swing as something for a child to remember. I sat on an overturned crate in that barn for close to 2 hours, working through one notebook after another, and the woman who emerged from those pages was not entirely the mother I had spent 35 years believing I knew. The second notebook, dated 2001, was harder to read, both because the ink had faded further and because of what it contained. That was the year my father left for good, and in it, my mother had written plainly that the studio would have to wait, because there was no one else to run the orchard, keep the books, and raise a daughter alone, and that some dreams, she noted, get put in a drawer, not because they die, but because there isn't room for them yet. She wrote about selling a small parcel of land that year, 8 acres along the eastern boundary, to cover legal fees from the divorce, and about deciding, quietly, not to mention any of it to me, because I was 7 years old, and she wanted my childhood to feel steady, even when nothing around her was. Reading that sentence, I thought about all the Sundays I let her calls go to voicemail, and about how steady she had always sounded whenever I finally called back. What she didn't know, and couldn't have known, was that I had spent most of my 20s assuming her calm was simply her nature, rather than something she built deliberately, notebook page by notebook page, so that I would never have to carry the weight she was carrying alone. I sat with that thought longer than I expected to, turning the pages slower, no longer looking for information so much as trying to hear her voice underneath the ink. Some pages were only lists, seed orders, dates of frost, a column of numbers that I eventually recognized as years she'd managed to put aside $40 or $50 toward the barn fund. A fund that never once grew past $600 before something more urgent always seemed to take it. I called Mr. Feeney that evening from the farmhouse kitchen, sitting at the same table where her reading glasses still waited for a woman who wasn't coming back for them. He told me what he could. My mother had retained him roughly 2 years earlier, not for anything related to a will or a will's contents, since that had been handled by a different attorney entirely, but specifically to hold a sealed letter and to make sure, in his words, her daughter didn't sign away the barn without opening it first. He read me the letter over the phone in a voice that made it clear this was not the first time he'd had to deliver difficult words to a stranger. In it, my mother wrote that she wasn't asking me to keep the farm, and she wasn't asking me to become an artist or a farmer or anyone other than exactly who I already was. She was only asking that whatever I decided to do with the land, I make the decision with my eyes open, knowing what she had actually spent her life quietly building in that barn, rather than assuming, the way I apparently always had, that her life had been made entirely of orchards, debts, and disappointment. I did not sleep much that night. I sat up going through the remaining notebooks instead, and a pattern began to take shape that I hadn't expected. The dream of the studio hadn't died in 2001. It had simply gone underground, resurfacing in fragments across 2 more decades. A notebook from 2008 mentioning a correspondence course in watercolor technique she'd taken by mail without telling anyone. A page from 2014 sketching a sign that read Sutton Farm Gallery, with hours listed as Saturdays when the harvest allows. A final entry, dated barely 16 months before her death, describing a conversation with a builder named Russ Calloway about the cost of adding proper windows to the barn's north wall for better light, and a rough estimate of $18,000, money she clearly hadn't had. The following morning, still running on almost no sleep, I drove into town and found Blue Ridge Land Partners' local representative, a brisk, not unkind man named Dale Hutchins, waiting on the possibility that I might want to walk through the closing details early. I told him I needed more time. He reminded me, correctly, that the 21-day contingency period existed for a reason, and that my mother's estate still owed $47,000, regardless of how I felt about a barn full of paintings. He wasn't wrong. I had no plan yet, only a growing conviction that I could not sign those papers without at least trying to understand what my mother had spent 30 years trying to build, and I told him so, plainly, and asked for an extension. He gave me 10 additional days with visible reluctance and made it clear there would not be an 11th. 10 days, $47,000 in debt, 41 paintings no one had ever seen, made by a woman who apparently could have shown them to the world decades earlier, if life had allowed it. I spent the first 2 of those 10 days simply cataloging what was in the barn, because I didn't know what else to do with my hands or my grief. I photographed each painting, cross-referenced them against the notebooks, and began to understand that my mother's work followed the orchard's own calendar. Bare winter branches in January, blossoms in April, the frantic green of July, the gold and rust chaos of harvest in late September and October. She had painted the same dozen trees from the same vantage points year after year, watching how they changed even as everything else in her life stayed exhausting and the same. On the third day, I drove out to see Russ Calloway, the builder my mother had spoken with about the north wall windows, mostly because his name was the only concrete lead I had toward understanding what a real studio would actually cost. Russ remembered my mother well. He told me she'd called him twice more after their initial conversation, each time asking slightly different questions about cost, as though she were trying to find a version of the number she could actually afford. He still had the original estimate on file. $18,200 for windows, insulation, and basic electrical work, not including any interior finishing. When I asked him, almost as a formality, what it might cost today, he did some rough math on the back of an invoice and told me closer to $23,000, given rising material costs. I sat in my car outside his shop for a long time afterward, running numbers that no longer had anything to do with a sale price or a closing date. That evening, back at the farmhouse, I made a decision I hadn't planned to make and called an art appraiser 2 counties over, a woman named Anna Anand, who specialized in undiscovered regional artists, mostly out of curiosity, mostly to prove to myself that I was being thorough rather than sentimental. She agreed to come look at the paintings 2 days later. In the meantime, I kept reading. The fifth notebook from 2019 contained something I wasn't prepared for, a full page addressed directly to me, though I clearly wasn't meant to read it until much later, if ever. In it, my mother wrote about a specific Sunday, 3 years before her death, when I had let her call go to voicemail 4 times in a row because I was, in her words, handling something at work that felt more urgent than her voice. She wrote that she understood, that she had built her own life out of choosing the orchard over things that mattered to her too, and that she wasn't angry, only sorry that we had both, in our own ways, learned to put the people and dreams we loved into drawers marked later. I read that page 4 times before I could bring myself to close the notebook. Anna Anand arrived on the 7th day of my 10-day window and spent nearly 3 hours in that barn with a flashlight and a notepad of her own. Her assessment, delivered carefully and without exaggeration, was that my mother's technical skill had clearly developed and matured across the decades represented in the work, that the consistency of subject matter across changing seasons gave the collection a genuine narrative quality regional galleries actively looked for, and that while she couldn't promise anything, she believed a curated show of 15 to 20 of the strongest pieces could realistically sell, collectively, somewhere between $12,000 and $20,000. Likely more if framed and marketed properly, with additional pieces available for a follow-up show. Anna also pointed out something I hadn't considered on my own. Several of the paintings, particularly the ones from the early 2000s showing the eastern boundary of the property before it was sold off to cover legal fees, had a documentary quality that a regional agricultural museum or historical society might be interested in acquiring separately for archival rather than decorative purposes. She gave me the name of a curator in Ellijay to contact. "When you're ready," she said, echoing without knowing it the same 3 words on the tag inside the basket. $12,000 to $20,000 was not $47,000. It was not $310,000. By the strict logic I had used to justify selling quickly in the first place, it solved nothing. But it was also not nothing. And somewhere in the 8th night of that 10-day window, sitting again at my mother's kitchen table with her notebook spread in front of me, I understood that I had been measuring the wrong thing entirely. My mother had never needed the barn to make her rich. She had needed it to stop being a drawer, and marked later, for once, for the last time, out loud. I called my husband that night and told him I wasn't selling the whole property, at least not yet, and that I needed his patience while I figured out something closer to what my mother had actually been asking for. He asked gently what that meant in practical terms, since $47,000 in debt didn't disappear because a barn full of paintings was beautiful. I told him the truth, which was that I didn't fully know yet, but that I had a plan taking shape, and I needed 2 more days to make it real instead of just a feeling. On the 9th day, I went back to Dale Hutchins and asked whether Blue Ridge Land Partners would consider purchasing a smaller parcel instead of the full 60 acres, specifically the 11 acres farthest from the farmhouse and barn, land that had never been part of the working orchard's core and had mostly sat fallow for years. Dale's first answer was no. He explained, not unsympathetically, that the company's offer had been calculated around the full 60 acres, that splitting the parcel would require a new survey, a new appraisal, and sign-off from a regional committee that met only once a month, and that none of that could realistically happen inside my remaining extension window. He suggested, gently, that I either sell the whole property now or walk away from the deal entirely and start over with a different buyer, likely at a lower price given how quickly I'd need to move. I sat in my car outside his office for a long time after that, seriously considering, for the first time since finding the key in the basket, whether I had made a mistake in coming back at all. I called Tom and told him I might have just talked myself out of the only real offer we had, over a barn full of paintings that might never sell for anywhere near what the debt actually required. He didn't try to talk me out of the doubt. He just asked one question. Did I still believe, sitting there in that parking lot, that my mother had been wrong to hide that key? I didn't. That was the only thing I was still certain of. I called Dale back the next morning and asked instead whether his regional office had any standing relationships with private buyers interested in smaller agricultural lots, the kind that didn't need a full committee review. It turned out they did. A local orchard family named the Pruitts had inquired twice in the past year about acquiring adjoining land to expand their own operation, and had been turned down before because my mother's full 60 acres had never been split for sale. After 2 phone calls to his regional office to confirm the boundary lines were clean, Dale came back with a number. The Pruitts would pay $105,000 for those 11 acres alone, in a private sale that didn't require Blue Ridge's committee at all, closable within the days I had left. It was far less than the full sale, but combined with the small equipment loan I could take against the remaining land, It was enough to clear the $47,000 in debt entirely, cover Russ Calloway's estimated $23,000 in barn renovations, and leave a modest cushion for framing and marketing the first show, the way Anna had suggested. I signed that smaller sale on the 10th day, in the same lawyer's office, where I had originally planned to sign away all 60 acres. It felt strange to feel relief and grief in the same signature, but I did. Renovation on the barn began 6 weeks later. Russ Calloway's crew kept the center beam exactly as it was, exactly as my mother had written in her earliest notebook, and even, at my specific request, kept the old rope swing hanging from it, sanded down and re-roped, but recognizably the same one I remembered from childhood. New windows went into the north wall, letting in a clean, even light that made the old red boards look almost gold in the late afternoon. Framing the 18 paintings turned out to be its own small education. I drove to a framing shop in Blue Ridge with Anna's list of recommended treatments, only to learn that proper archival framing for that many canvases would run closer to $4,000 than the $1,500 I'd budgeted, since several of the paintings needed specialized UV protective glass to prevent further fading from decades in an unheated barn. I nearly postponed the show over it until the shop's owner, a woman named Louise who had known my mother slightly from the farmer's market, offered to do the work at cost, plus a small discount once I explained whose paintings they were and why they'd been hidden for so long. It still cost more than I had planned. I paid it anyway, out of the small cushion Dale's sale had left me, and told myself it was the last time I would let a number decide something that mattered this much. The hanging itself took 2 full days longer than Russ and I expected, mostly because I kept second-guessing the order. Moving the same 6 paintings between the north and east walls more times than I could count, trying to find an arrangement that told the story the way the notebooks had rather than simply by year. Anna finally sat me down the night before the opening and told me, kindly but firmly, that I was avoiding the last real decision. The placement of the final canvas, an unfinished piece from the notebook dated only months before my mother's death, showing the orchard mid-bloom with one corner left entirely blank, as though she had run out of time rather than inspiration. I nearly left it in storage. Anna convinced me to hang it anyway, exactly as it was, unfinished corner and all, in the last spot along the north wall, closest to the door. The first show opened on a Saturday in early April, 7 months after that phone call from Mr. Feeney about a locked door. We called it, at Anna's suggestion, simply Dorothy Sutton, 26 Years of the Orchard, and hung 18 of the 41 paintings along the new north wall, arranged not by year but by season, the way my mother had actually lived her life, circling the same losses and small joys again and again, waiting for the right moment to let them be seen. I stood near the old rope swing that afternoon, watching neighbors I hadn't spoken to in over a decade move slowly past canvases of trees they recognized from their own drives past the farm, some of them crying quietly, most of them saying some version of the same thing. I didn't know Dorothy painted. I didn't either, I told more than one of them. Not until 9 days before I was supposed to sign this whole place away. By the end of that first Saturday, 6 paintings had sold, for a combined total of just over $7,000, And Anna had already fielded 2 calls from a gallery in Atlanta asking about a second show in the fall. It wasn't the number that mattered to me by then. What mattered was the sign Russ Calloway had helped me hang above the barn's newly repainted east door that morning. The same door that had been padlocked shut for months after my mother's death. Sutton Farm Gallery. Saturdays, when the harvest allows. Denise came, too, near the end of the afternoon, standing quietly in front of a painting of the orchard in full October color. The one my mother had painted the same year Denise's own mother had passed. She didn't say much, only that she hadn't expected to cry over a painting of trees she'd driven past her whole life without really looking at them. I told her I understood completely, since I'd spent 35 years doing exactly the same thing. That night, after the last visitor had gone and Tom had driven back into town to return the folding chairs we'd borrowed, I walked out to the barn alone. The new windows let in the last of the evening light exactly the way Russ had promised they would, gold, and even across the wooden floor. I found myself standing under the old rope swing, the same one from every childhood summer, sanded down now, but recognizably itself, and I gave it a small push, just to hear the rope creak the way it always had. I thought about the 3 strokes across a kitchen counter that never needed cleaning, and the letters I let sit unanswered for weeks at a time, and the Sunday calls I sent to voicemail because something else always felt more urgent. I couldn't undo any of that, but I could keep the door open now instead of padlocked, and that, I decided, standing in a barn full of my mother's finished work, was its own kind of answer to a question I hadn't known I was still asking. I kept the green enamel basket. It hangs by the back door of the farmhouse now, exactly where it always did, except these days it holds brushes instead of apples, because some things, I've learned, are only ever waiting for someone to be ready to open them.